the human condition is that we need to be connected, right? So it doesn't matter if you live in whatever the rich area of Ontario is, or it doesn't matter which area of town you live in. We have that human need to be connected, to be understood, to be seen. And then we can do all of that other work.
That's Dr. Shannon Behan, who is back as a guest on our podcast this week. Dr. Behan is the president of the British Columbia Principal and Vice Principal Association, also known as the BCPVPA. Hi there, I'm Stan Baker, one of the hosts of Circle Forum, along with Shelley Steele and Steve Young. In a world forever changed by COVID, principals are faced with new challenges, but one thing remains clear. Before we push academic goals, we must first nurture the human spirit. And in this podcast, we talk about the essential work of building connection and emotional well-being in schools.
This podcast is brought to you by the word belonging, which comes from Old English meaning dependent or at hand. Over time, the meaning has shifted to a sense of being part of something larger. The concept of belonging can vary significantly across cultures. In individualistic societies, belonging is often tied to personal achievement and autonomy, while in collectivist cultures, it is more about relationships, family ties, and group identity. Sounds like the contrast between a colonial culture and an indigenous one to me.
Check out our website, www.restorative.ca, for simple ways to build belonging, voice, and agency. 3 basic principles of restorative practices. Now let's join Dr. Shannon Behan along with your hosts, Shelley, Steve, and me, Stan. One of the things that really strikes me about what Fullan writes and really caught my attention that I really appreciate is what he calls spirit work. Mm-hmm. And he just paints a picture that, look, the context for education is a very complex world where we've had COVID, where we've got all kinds of disenfranchised people, where we have inequities, we have economic disparity, and so on. And in the middle of that, we have to teach. And he says that the most important thing is to talk about what it means to be human and where do you find meaning and purpose. He doesn't talk about literacy first. That is something that comes up, but he talks about the spirit work, that the principal's role in that is so essential.
I know. And the term spirit work also, again, it goes back to maybe it's just articulating a little bit of what we already know, but part of the challenge that some schools faced, I think, coming out of COVID is that we all heard the term about learning loss, and we better get on with really refocusing our literacy and our numeracy programs and start really driving hard and fast at our academic goals. I'm not sure what we did was stop and say, hey, everybody, are we okay being back here? Can we form our own community? How are you doing in the greater sense? And I'm not sure if all of us took a moment to do that, because we do see the outcomes of COVID in academic losses and that kind of stuff. But did we take the moment to do that spirit work of connecting? How are you guys doing? How's your family doing? How has it been to be isolated for 3, 4, 5 months, 2 years, or whatever it is? How has life changed now that your parents work online and at home? Did we ask those questions? Yeah, and that's the spirit work. That's the piece. You can't, it's just like all of us. We can't go home and do research or manage everything we need to manage in our day when we ourselves are dysregulated. So that's the work of the principal, is to make sure the kids and the families are regulated. That's the spirit work. I do agree with that.
Yeah, and I think COVID brought that to light, obviously, that we have to start thinking about our students first and our staff and who they are and how they're doing before we worry about the work. It's a flip-flop. Years ago in York Region, Fullan worked with us on what we call the Literacy Collaborative Project. It was about a 5 to 8 years project across all the schools in the board, and it was focused so heavily on literacy. And the criticism of us, it was all about literacy all the time, and we weren't thinking about the students who were trying to push this literacy on. And that's where I think I know that's where I started to change my focus on how I saw education, that we have to think of students first. And that's where I got into restorative practices and thinking about those relationships and things. But there was a group that started many years ago in the States. I don't know if it's probably still around if you Googled it. It's called Maslow Before Bloom. And essentially saying we need to look after our students first and look after their basic needs before we start worrying about their academic goals. If they're not ready to learn, then what's the point of pushing learning on them? We need to get them ready for learning. And I think COVID just magnified that in so many ways. And as you're right, when we came back, we started jumping on the bandwagon to catch up, but we forgot that some of these people have been through some pretty tough times, and they've seen relatives die. They've maybe had COVID themselves. They've struggled, and we need to take that into account before we start cramming the academics on them again. I'm not sure how much of that. I know a lot of that was principals. I worked up to COVID, but not since COVID. I have friends who are still working in the role, and they had to take a few steps back and really think about their staff, the teachers, as well as the students, and were the teachers ready for all that heavy work, let alone the students. And we've still got kids who are at home learning online and all those kind of things that we learned from COVID, which I think was a positive that came out of it, if nothing else. Yeah, I think it really refocused where I was 20 years ago, saying, let's think about our learners first before we think about the academics or the curriculum. So maybe it's because I was in a low socioeconomic area. I was in a school that was heavily challenged, and if we scored 20 or 30% on at provincial average, that was a good year for us on our EQAO scores. And so to us, there were so many more important things than getting higher EQAO scores. It was making sure kids were fed and got to school on time and got sleep at night, and all those Maslow things that we weren't really focusing on then, but I had to.
No, you have to. And I don't think it's dependent on socioeconomic.
No, it's not at all. No, not at all.
The human condition is that we need to be connected, right? So it doesn't matter if you live in whatever the rich area of Ontario is, or it doesn't matter which area of town you live in. We have that human need to be connected, to be understood, to be seen. And then we can do all of that other work. But until that foundation pieces, and we need it in different ways, depending on our context, for sure.
To your point with that, just a real quick story. I was in a school that was very high achieving. I went from one end to the other of the spectrum. It was one of the top 10 schools on the Fraser report year after year as an elementary school. So high achieving by all accounts. But one of the biggest things we dealt with was students with their mental health issues, because they were so highly pressured to produce at a high level that kids were literally breaking down and faltering. And if they got a poor mark on a test, which to them was like a 92, when my parents expected 98, it was like crying and tears, and I can't go home with this, and what am I going to do about it? It had nothing to do. It was a very high socioeconomic area, very high achieving, and yet we were dealing with all sorts of, I'll say, trauma with a lot of our higher students, especially the ones in intermediate grades going to high school, who were trying to get into their high school of choice, and marks made a difference, or an arts-based school or a sports school or whatever it was. The pressure was on them so heavily that they were struggling with it. Yeah.
And that exactly, for me, outlines the spirit work or contextual literacy that the principal has to innately have, because regardless of the socioeconomic standings of the culture and the community, you have to act and react. And it demands different things of a principal that are, I think, equally as difficult. I was at 2 different schools at different times where I think I had, this goes back a few years, but I had a really old Volkswagen that I drove into the parking lot, and I was lucky if I found a space, because all the kids had Audis and BMWs, and I was early on in my years of leadership, but it demanded things very differently of me. They didn't need food, they didn't need clothes, but they needed so much more in different ways. And because they were worried, all of us have worries and baggage, whatever, but it's the spirit work, that's the contextual literacy, that's whatever it is that we want to call it. That's the art of the principal, recognizing it and then understanding it and then still doing something with it and about it.
And what I like about what Fullan says is that he says this is more urgent than it's ever been. It was urgent in the past, but with COVID, there's been, hey, life is short. I don't know that we have to go to school this week. Why don't you stay home? The education we didn't always have to be at school during COVID. And now that kind of attitude has been extended. Plus, the size of the problems that kids are facing, they want something that gives them meaning and so on. And what kinds of things can principals do then to help build hope in schools and in students, hope and meaning?
All the good questions. I guess it's, what do people want? They want connection. They want to be seen. What does it mean to be seen? I don't know. I'm a big fan of Dr. Jody Carrington, and so I love all her writings and her podcasts, but how do the kids know that we see who they are, that we understand them, what are the things that principals that you're doing in your schools every day to engage with your student community? And it's the simple stuff. It's be outside. At recess, if you're in an elementary school, play with the kids. And high school kids are just elementary students that don't have more BO. But, and they've got more on their plate for sure. But they're still just humans all trying to figure themselves out. Connect with kids, connect with families. The humility piece, that I think should exist on the part of any principal. You don't have all the answers and you don't need to, but what you need to do is see the population, see the kids, get to know who they are. If there's intramurals at lunch, be on the volleyball team, be on the basketball team, do those things, because the kids just, they just need to be seen and recognized, know they have value. They need to know that it matters that you come to school. And I always had these beautiful little needy Pete's. The bell was gone, everybody's in class, and about 9:03, 15 minutes late, a few of them are coming into school, and all I say is, wow, Steve, is so great that you're here today. I am so happy to see you. That's all, make it matter that these people are coming to you every day. And you can only imagine how difficult it is, where they got up and could they find the right socks and did they have breakfast and all of those things. Make it matter truly that they come to school, because it goes back to that whole spirit work, that we can't do all the rest of that hard work unless we know we value the relationships that we have with one another. We're all on this planet just trying to figure it out together.
And as a leader in a school, you can't fix all those things for kids, whether it's disconnect, they could have all the material needs they need, but a disconnect from an adult, or we can talk about some basics. So you can't fix all those things, but what you can do is control what's in your building, right? And with all those things you just talked about, it doesn't matter what was going on outside your building, you can make them feel connected with those things.
So I think when we put it in the context of leadership and the principal's role, it's an ever evolving thing. And yet there are some very basic elements to the job that have never changed. I think of principals that I had when I was in an elementary school and 10 years old. They were the ones that we got along with, we talked to. They would come and talk to us. I remember one guy would trade hockey cards with us. I was 7 years old. He'd come in with a big stack of cards. We'd sit and trade hockey cards. That's how he built relationship with kids. That stuff never changes. So we can call it different things. We can say we're co-learners versus instructional leaders. All that stuff is out there, but the basics are always going to remain the same. It's about relationships.
So how do principals create spaces where students feel seen, understood, and supported? Well, you heard Steve say it. It's about the relationships first and last. Before principals push academic goals, they must first nurture the human spirit. It's the essential work of building connection and emotional well-being in schools. Find out more about our work with restorative circles that really do exactly that, build connection and well-being in classrooms, in staff rooms, and in boardrooms through restorative practices at www.restorative.ca. It's helpful for me, too, to be reminded again about the values that brought principals to their roles in schools.